The British journalist and broadcaster Sir Peregrine Worsthorne died last year, but Dr. Kevin Hickson of the University of Liverpool believes that the arguments which he developed through his writings bear an important message for our times. Here, in an audio version of his article published in Bournbrook's 15th print issue, which new subscribers will receive for free by following the link in this video's description, Dr. Hickson discusses the wisdom of Sir Peregrine Worsthorne.
It would be very easy to dismiss the commentary of Sir Peregrine Worsthorne, who died last year at the grand age of 96, as the words of a snob. However, such a view would be mistaken, for although he was a snob, by his own admission he loved a toff. There was more to his ideas than that. Moreover, as this article will show, his ideas provide both an insightful understanding of the past, as well as a useful guide for contemporary conservatives. Worsthorne was born in 1923 into firmly aristocratic stock, both British and Belgian. He was educated at Stowe and later claimed that his contemporary and later jazz musician George Melly had seduced him. He went on to Peterhouse College, Cambridge, a recruiting ground for conservative politicians with a reputation as being firmly on the political right. In the Second World War, he served alongside Michael Oakeshott, who he claimed to have influenced his political ideas, albeit in a way he couldn't really define. After the war, Worsthorne became a journalist briefly for the Glasgow Herald and the Times before settling at the Telegraph, eventually becoming editor of the Sunday Telegraph. See the obituaries for more detail of his activities in these various roles. Although Worsthorne claimed that it was not the job of a columnist to develop a consistent thesis, but rather to write things that would sell newspapers, as well as challenge its readership, he did in fact develop a clear and consistent argument, both in his columns and his books, most notably The Socialist Myth, published in 1971, and In Defence of Aristocracy, published in 2004. The thesis he articulated, that politics is concerned with the preservation of a strong and authoritative ruling class, would at one time have been mainstream, but by the time he was writing it, already seemed antiquated. In a fascinating, if rather idiosyncratic collection of essays by academics, journalists and politicians, Conservative Essays, edited by Maurice Cowling and published in 1978, Worsthorne argued that the central task of conservative politics was the promotion of the interests of the ruling class. The argument was deemed outdated even by some of his fellow contributors, Worsthorne told me. Society, so his argument went, was divided into a talented minority and an untalented majority. Echoing classical elitists like Pareto, Worsthorne argued that society needed to manage the natural transition of its elites. The existing elite will always be challenged by those seeking to replace it, move too fast or too slowly, and the whole system becomes unstable. The difficulty, however, is that the best arguments in a democracy can always be made by those seeking to challenge the existing elite, because it can always pretend that it is not interested in power for itself, but only in serving the wider interest of the majority by removing the selfish elite. In reality, the newly created elite has to impose its own authority more directly than the traditional elite. Democracy will always favour the radicals in this sense, even though their radicalism is only really pretense, disguising their own desire for power. The more difficult task is the conservative one, which is concerned with maintaining the status quo. In Britain, the traditional ruling aristocracy have been very skillful. It has survived the transition from feudalism to capitalism very effectively by forming a partnership with the newly emerging business and industrial class, unlike on the continent of Europe, where it largely failed to do this and ended up being overthrown, most obviously in the French Revolution of 1789. Britain had never therefore emerged as a fully capitalist state. Later critics would use this to explain why Britain had experienced relative economic decline since 1945 and called for an enterprise society. Worsthorne rejected such calls in the strongest terms, arguing that Margaret Thatcher's revolution was one of bourgeois triumphalism, the first time in British history when the middle class had succeeded without the wise and constraining influence of the aristocracy with its sense of noblesse oblige. Sadly for him, the traditional ruling class had lost its grip by 1939, and in the post-war era was replaced by rival elites. The first was socialist. However, socialists, even the moderate British kind, suffered from a central intellectual problem. They preached the incompatible objectives of greater equality in state planning of the economy. These things were incompatible, since socialists would need to be revered by mass society in order to pursue their economic policies. But their egalitarianism eroded the authority on which socialist economic policies depended. In a culture in which everyone was equal, no one was special. The problem with socialism, therefore, was not that it eroded individual freedom, as the economic liberals protested, but rather authority. Indeed, by the 1970s, this had progressed to such an extent that what people feared was not the loss of freedom, apart from the wealthy who faced higher direct taxation, but rather its excessive abundance. The truth at present, he wrote in 1978, is that all forms of discipline are breaking down. What Britain is suffering from is riotous disorder. Sadly, he went on, Mrs. Thatcher did not understand this, and instead she talked about the need to set the people free. Her agenda of liberal economics came at considerable cost. Later, Worsthorne would argue that it was the legacy of Thatcherism that people should look to, and that legacy had been, and I quote, spectacularly and horribly destructive of much that made this country a lovable place. Far from being conservative, Thatcherism was a radical political project which thrived on conflict and permanent revolution. The 1980s was a horrible decade, scarred by urban unrest, industrial conflict, and ending in the poll tax riots. Unemployment soared to 3 million, and deindustrialisation occurred on a mass scale. Anyone who expressed regret was dismissed as a wet, an ugly term for those possessing a social conscience. The body politic was left sick unto death. Modern society assumed the character of a rat race, where the only skill that mattered was the ability to elbow others out of the way. By the end of her time in power, Thatcher was herself expressing regret at the actions of the newly wealthy. None of the permissive legislation of the 1960s was undone or its social consequences addressed. The divorce rate was higher by the end of Thatcher's premiership than at the start. Those who seek to defend Thatcher's legacy would be well advised to read Worsthorne, or Peter Hitchens for that matter, on the social consequences of Thatcherism. Not the words of a usual suspect on the left of politics, but someone firmly on the right who come to the view that it was Harold Macmillan and not Thatcher who best exemplified what conservatism properly understood was about. However, things would only become worse after Thatcher's removal from office. The erosion of a public service ethos led to the sleaze and corruption of the Conservative government under her successor, John Major. The greatest challenge of the early years of the new millennium, he warned, would be the economic consequences of corporate greed, something that came to fruition with the crash of 2008, when the scale of risk in the financial services sector, and in Britain and the United States in particular, became all too apparent, and which led to the austerity agenda from which our public services are still recovering. Thatcher had unleashed the financial sector, and New Labour had turned a blind eye to its practices, just as long as the tax revenues came rolling in. The consequences of New Labour on our culture and on our constitution were far-reaching and much worse than Old Labour, which had a respect for British political institutions and traditions. Indeed, in 1979, Worsthorne had expressed sympathy for Jim Callaghan, whose conservatism appealed, while Thatcher's radicalism repulsed him. New Labour had effectively abandoned the economic case of old-fashioned socialists in the face of Thatcherite success, but had embraced social liberalism in its place. The radicalism of Tony Blair laid his agenda for cultural and constitutional change, which had far greater long-term consequences than the economic policies of old Labour. So what does this perspective provide us with for our current times? Firstly, I would argue that the central task of our political leaders is to move away decisively from the economic liberal paradigm which has existed since the election of Margaret Thatcher in 1979 in favour of a more socially responsible and nationally oriented economic model. Secondly, to stress the importance of social responsibility over individual freedom and rights, a rejection of the hyper-liberalism which is undermining the social fabric. And finally, resolving the unfinished and imbalanced constitutional legacy of New Labour in favour of the English, who are disadvantaged financially and democratically by current arrangements. Whether either of the two major parties is capable of performing such a feat is questionable.